get started? Ready to get started? Sure. Okay. All right. Welcome, everyone. Hello. My name is Jackie. I'm your event host from RJ Julia. Thank you so much for coming. I have the great pleasure of introducing our lovely guests of honor tonight. So a little bit about them before we get started. Rachel Slade is the author of national bestseller and New York Times notable book, Into the Raging Sea. Joining us here tonight to celebrate her newest novel, which I see a lot of you have already picked up, Making It in America. Described as a treasure trove of fascinating, relevant historical information, both a delight and an education, which in my opinion is the perfect combination. A little bit of everything. Joining her in conversation this evening is Edward Cooke, Yale professor in the Department of the History of Art and author of several novels, including Making Furniture in Pre-Industrial America, Inventing Boston, and Global Objects. That one you may have seen we have available at the registers tonight. So if you're interested, please pick up a copy at the end. It is safe to say we're in great company with these two. We will have time for Q&A as well as a signing line after the event. So if you wanted to get your books personalized, we'll do that at the back of the room after. And if you haven't picked up your copy yet, we have them available at the registers. So sure excited to hear this conversation. So I'll stop rambling. But thank you so much for coming, and I'll hand it over to you guys. Enjoy.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming out on a good March evening. It's New England weather. So Rachel, one of the things that you're talking about over the course of a couple of years that this book has been in process is this notion about making and manufacturing. So I thought it might be useful to just come up with the first word in the title, making. What's your relationship with this concept of making?
Yeah, so I went to architecture school. I call myself a reformed architect because I no longer practice architecture. Obviously, I'm too busy doing other things. But when I was at architecture school, mine was the last class to not have computers in the studios. And yeah, everybody's like, oh yeah, remember those days? Yeah.
People could draw.
So what we had to do obviously was, well, we had two options when you were to produce a drawing. It was either ink on Mylar or pencil. So you had to construct a perspective, for example. The other thing that we had to do was craft models. And so there was a workshop with all kinds of really dangerous tools. I still have all my fingers, I'm glad to say, but the point is that through that experience, I learned how important it was to learn how to fabricate, how materials come together, how you create joints, how you create an envelope, for example, that doesn't allow the water to come in. You need to get these fundamental understandings about materiality, about what we can do with materials in order to innovate. It's as simple as that. So what we would do is we would have this idea, some crazy idea about joining this to this to that. And we would take it to the shop guy, the poor beleaguered shop guy. And he would either say, nope, not gonna work. But more often than not, his job was to tell us how to do this thing. If it can't work the way we imagine, why? Right? And through that learning, I began to really value how things are made. So when something actually works, right? When you actually buy something that actually works and lasts a long time, there's so much human knowledge imbued in that object, in that piece of apparel, in that fabric. And so the making, I feel like I know, is what it means to be human for me. The fabrication, the design, and the execution of objects is uniquely human. It's what makes us human. And it's also, and this is very much material culture, right? It's how we define ourselves and our relationship to others. So that was the start of making for me, being in that shop, trying to glue metal to glass or whatever crazy thing I was trying to do.
Copper to glass goes better.
Okay, thank you. It's been a long time. And then, the practice of architecture ended up becoming CAD. So, and after 5 years of, sitting mostly at a computer, I just said, this is not fulfilling anymore.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, that whole notion that we can talk about the alienation from materials and methods of making. And there's a longer history here that is very much of a 20th century story, that CAD is only the most recent kind of chapter in that, in terms of thinking about materials are less about local materials or things that are being extracted and exploited from different areas and moved around the world, which is part of the whole trade systems. But the fact that a lot of materials are now engineered, they come out of laboratories, they come out of a whole different process that most kids growing up don't know anything about materials. They just know sort of like the finished product without knowing something about where the material came from. And that whole notion about alienation from making as well, that if something's manufactured, it is distant. It's not around you the same way, you know, if you were growing up on a farm and having to repair tools and, you know, being kind of making do, and maintenance is one of these things that is totally forgotten now. And even the way in which our education system is structured, that, you know, even in the late 19th century, they would have manual arts training because they thought getting small motor skills and learning, you know, they weren't training operatives for machinery, but they thought, yes, that could be good for some people, but also would encourage good taste. If you knew something about proportions and shapes, so you turned wood on a lathe, or you learned how to throw pottery, or you learned something about a printing press and how to set type, that this was all considered part of one's education. And that kind of, if you think about what that leads to as a knowledge worker, you know, there is that kind of innovative capacity. There's that ability to problem solve because you know from the ground up what's going on. And now what we have is this sense of a totally different world that you just consume, you buy and consume,
Right.
without any sort of sense of making. So one of the things you also got interested in making is the shipping of mass quantities of objects. Talk a little bit, I mean, from your previous book of Into the Raging Sea, which is about a container ship. That it's a wonderful read if you're interested in maritime weather and disasters. Titanic has nothing on.
Yeah, so actually, if you're wondering how I know Ned, and you might have noticed that Ned is taller than I am, it's because we actually met through crew and through rowing. So Ned is a rower and I was a coxswain. I used to be a rower, now I'm just a coxswain, or I was. But we were both, we discovered, attracted to the sport, not for its physicality necessarily, but for its beauty and the beauty of these boats, which are all small batch because there are very few buyers. And this is a very high-end product, and they're extremely engineered, you know, to do one thing, like move quickly, stay low in the water, but move quickly and reduce drag. And so all the equipment on that boat was just like this, it just drew me to the sport. So I love boats. I've always loved boats. And I guess my love of boats just kept getting bigger. Literally. And when I read about the Alfaro, which was a container ship, which an American container ship was sunk in 2015, killing all 33 people aboard. I was immediately drawn to, you know, understanding shipping. What is modern shipping? Who drives these ships? Who mans these ships? And how could a ship disappear in 2015 with all the modern navigation on board? But ultimately, you know, it became an opportunity for me to start to understand global trade, right? Because wait, it's not just a boat, it's carrying things from one place to another. And then starting to recognize, you know, I live in Boston, which is a tiny port. We have very little ships going in there. But as we've just seen with the Key Bridge, I mean, the size of these ships is like inconceivable at this point. That one was 3 football fields long, right? So it must have been more actually, because the football field is 100 yards, right? So, but anyway, so these massive ships these massive ships, with super deep drafts. You know, incredible things can go wrong. But these are the ships on which we depend now for every aspect of modern life. And that's actually why I start my book. You'll see in the introduction, there's just a very short description of during the pandemic, when all of us began to realize how dependent we were on those ships, when the backup at Long Beach and in the port of LA was making headline. I couldn't believe it. I'd been talking about this for a couple of years, you know, like, hello, we really depend on shipping, like we need to pay attention to shipping. And then suddenly, you know, it's making headlines because we see the empty shelves, and now we're making the connection about, you know, how close we are to pandemonium if those ships don't come. And I like to make this connection. I read this. New York City is actually 3 days away from non-functioning at all if the ships stopped coming. If you just 3 days and New York would not function. So then you think about what happened in Baltimore, where, you know, you have a backup, or you remember when the Suez Canal, the Evergrande got, I think it was called Evergrande, got stuck in the Suez Canal, and just the amount of cargo that can't get through. And then now, of course, with the problems, the group of, in the Red Sea. You know, it just keeps hitting us again and again and again as to how dependent we are and how vulnerable we are.
It's interesting sort of thinking about COVID being a time of awareness of some of these issues, because I also found in teaching during COVID that all of a sudden I oftentimes teach at the Yale Art Gallery and use real objects to talk about what I term as material literacy, which is trying to rebuild this sense of materials and processes. And I was faced with how do I convey this? Because reading about it, watching YouTube videos is not enough. So I developed.
And you talked about this idea of the gentleman's
knowledge. You know, going back to Diderot, of sort of like, if you can present the tools in a nice graphic way, that means you understand how something is used, what kind of tools are being used for different trades. And if you watch a video now of it, you know, that's simply another way of thinking that you know how something is done. But I actually would challenge anybody to watch a video and think that they can make something. You might be able to repair something, but making something is totally different. So what I decided to do with COVID was thinking that these kids are watching the screen too much for, you know, recorded lectures and things. It was the fall of 2020. People had lack of faith in the U.S. Postal Service. So I developed making kits that I could send out to all the students who were not in residence, and also had some that I could meet the students in open air to exchange this. And so I developed 3 different kits that they could work with a cardboard loom and learn how to weave and what warp and weft meant. I developed something with copper discs that they could hammer, just using a ball peen hammer and a steel block. And then did something with clay, which I gave them 2 pounds of clay, a banding wheel, which is almost like a lazy Susan, and then sort of a video of how to coil something, and had them write reflections on it. It was pivotal moment in my teaching, that all of a sudden now I'm incorporating making exercises in most classes, and it's remarkable to watch what these students, like, the light bulb goes off.
So you didn't get angry letters from parents saying, I'm spending so much money
No.
on Yale, and they're making clay.
They're making pots and hammering. I mean, and actually, it was really interesting with the hammering copper. It, you know, the incessant noise could drive some people crazy, but actually, a lot of roommates got involved and said, "Can I do a round of hammering as well?" So that, you know, everyone was so captivated with the fact that this is real stuff. You're not on a screen during COVID, and you actually sort of can do something.
That's
So
fascinating.
to me, it's like, it's this pivotal moment when these supply chains are disrupted, and all of a sudden I mean, I think that's true of food during COVID too.
Mhm.
People all of a sudden eating more local food rather than and how people became so much more aware of regional kind of systems and culture.
Yes. I was really hopeful during COVID. I mean, obviously it was a horrible time.
Always look for silver linings.
Yeah. If I'm gonna look for a silver lining, I was hopeful for that very reason, because I mean, this is very much part of my story. So this is actually a story about a husband and wife who started a small apparel company up in Maine. But they didn't just want to make apparel, they wanted to make fully American sourced apparel. And if that wasn't enough of a charge, they also, he had a union background. He was with the AFL-CIO for a decade before he started this company. And so he made sure that their workers were unionized as well. I mean, this is like the world's most impossible task. They're a complete unicorn. But what was hopeful for me vis-a-vis all that we've been talking about during the pandemic was we were all forced to protect ourselves. Nobody was going to do it for us. There was such a shortage of masks, right? And they were all supposed to go to hospitals, whatever was left, right, from China, because we don't produce masks anymore.
And we didn't stockpile them.
And we didn't stockpile them, and that's another story. So either we decided we weren't going to protect ourselves and we were going to just say, no, I don't need to protect myself, it's not airborne. Or those among us who had any understanding of how to make things were pulling out, who did this? Pulling out, sewing machine, bolts of fabric, finding anything, and like actually making things for survival for our family. Right, so I actually like crafted this crazy mask for my husband because he has a big old beard, and so I don't know what a mask for a beard looks like, and I just had to like invent this thing. And Etsy, this is in my book, but Etsy actually put out a call to makers on their site, and they said, make masks, and makers did. You know, and there's just this incredibly beautiful regional thing happening actually on Etsy and in other places where, you know, people were starting to make masks for their area, for their first responders, for their hospital employees. Like this was a thing, it was just like a very beautiful moment to me, sorry. And that's what happened to this company. So is it
based on a true story?
Yeah.
This is a true story. Yeah, this is 100% true. I can't.
You got to realize that the genre Rachel works in is, I describe it as historical nonfiction. So I mean, it's oftentimes big picture, but with a lot of individual kinds of biography woven in, and an occasional little detour into something that's happening at a time. Get off the main highway, investigate the deeper history or something, get back on with the individuals. That's the way the book reads,
Yeah.
which is awesome.
Oh, thank you, Matt.
It's like a conversation, but you remember how to get back.
Yeah,
Wait.
you still have the brain map.
It's like, okay. But so this company, they had at that point, they started in 2015. So in March of 2020, they had 30 employees. So it's very small, right? And Ben, it was a husband and wife founder. And Ben took a minute. You can't, when you're in production, you can't stop. You can't leave. You can't stop selling. You can't stop making. You can't walk away. It's like having a farm, right? Like you can't leave. But he took a minute to memorialize a friend who had committed suicide. And so he actually went onto Route 66 with some friends. And then he's watching the TVs and he's seeing what's happening. And it's COVID.
It's like March 8th, 9th, 10th.
Yeah. And he does a little bit of math on the back of an envelope, and he realizes that they're not going to survive. If they have to close down the factory, they won't be able. They had 2 payrolls in the bank. You know, they have no cushion, and they will have to sell all of their equipment, and basically they're done. And they didn't have private equity. They didn't have venture capital investment. They mortgaged their They mortgaged their house. They had cashed in their retirements to start this company. And there's when you're a manufacturer like this in America, there is no mercy, right? If you make too many things and people aren't buying, no mercy, you're done, right? If you have too many employees and an order falls through, you're done. Like, there are no tolerances. This is a really tough business, and that's why I wanted to write about it. I mean, we're talking about material literacy, like understanding what goes into the fabric of our lives, but also, just think about the human element and the entrepreneurial business side of this, how difficult it is. And we actually have somebody in the room who is doing this right now, custom clothing. Matt does custom clothing right here in Connecticut. So thanks for coming, Matt. But anyway, so Ben realizes that they're not going to survive. If the country is closed down for 2 months, they're dead, they're gone. All of their investment, bankruptcy, over. So he returns to Westbrook outside of Portland, Maine. And that Saturday night, he's sitting on the sofa with Whitney, his partner, his business partner, his wife, the mother of his children. And they're watching what's happening in New York City. Do you remember? I mean, it was just, I couldn't watch it. And the nurses and the doctors and the hospital administrators are saying, we were running out of, suddenly everybody knew what, PPE was, we're running out of this and we don't know what we're gonna do next. And so Whitney, at that moment, turned to her husband and said, we make things. We can make this, we can do this. So they went to their workers that following Monday and they said, we don't know what this thing is, this virus, this COVID, we don't know what this is. But if we figure out how to make this factory as safe as we can, we'll separate the machines, we'll put down the plastic, we'll clean. Will you come back? Now remember, I want you to understand that most of their workers are who we call new Americans, recent arrivals, many of them political asylum, seeking political asylum, coming from very difficult places. And they have families at home, right? And every single one of these people said yes. They would come back, they would make the masks, they would make the face shields, they would make whatever the country needed because they were now American. And that's what we do for each other. So I thought that was a beautiful moment for us to appreciate the power of making, but they became very powerful at that moment. They became some of the most important people in America at that moment because they could make things. And it's the loss of making that worries a lot of people. That's just one cautionary tale.
It also raises this whole notion about work, that there's a way in which we tend to fetishize the individual worker. And I keep thinking about reading Studs Terkel growing up and sort of the great oral histories of different kinds of, his title Working from 1974, or even how the Obama's film production went into, an ode to studs with their Working movie about hotel workers and healthcare workers and tech people. But oftentimes the emphasis is really on the individual, the heroic individual whose, self-dignity is something that we sort of need to pay attention to. But oftentimes what's missing is that sense of cooperative work in some respects, that we do not do things only on our own, that we're part of teams, we're part of larger systems. And that's where not just dignity and value, but also sort of that sense of connectedness is so crucial. And it's something we've been fighting against since John Ruskin and sort of the idea of the nobility of craft in the late 19th century. But I think it's one of the key parts of this book is sort of using a term like New Americans, of talking about this kind of investment of this team that are deciding how to space the workspaces out during COVID, and the sense that they're all in it together in some respects, and even sort of the ways in which Ben is finding who some of the different family businesses are North Carolina, to Massachusetts. And, I wanted you to read that one section about Anne, that I think Anne Russo, who's a cutter, that really,
Pattern maker.
I think really speaks to this idea of material literacy and how dependent we are on this kind of what I oftentimes refer to as tacit knowledge. That is something that is it's embodied as well, of sort of like your experience is cumulative and gives you insights. It doesn't mean you're going to do the same thing over and over again, but it means that you've got a body of empirical knowledge that you keep building off of, adding to, adjusting depending on different situations. But there's something about, in it, there are many other people in here but I think Anne Russo is probably your classic example of this.
Yeah, she's such a great character. So, all right, so she is a professional pattern maker in Quincy, Massachusetts. She was the second generation apparel maker. She says her Italian grandparents, saddled with 8 kids, were too poor to keep their children out of the labor market. So her mother skipped high school and learned tailoring from the local nuns. In those days, all immigrants learned how to sew, Anne says. So Anne ends up getting contacted by Ben and Whitney to design their first piece of apparel. And when an apparel maker like American Roots called Anne for pattern, she'd have them send over a concept drawing, which she then discussed in detail with them. She'd ask tons of questions. The answers would help her construct the most appropriate garment for the job. The first thing she wanted to know was what the fabric piece would be made of. Then she'd get into more details. What was the skill level of the sewing staff? These are things like, who thinks of it, right? This is so great. What would the garment be used for? What kinds of people would wear the garment? A fleece vest designed for telephone linemen would be built very differently from a vest designed for desk workers. Both would be different from one worn by day hikers. The cut would be different. The location of the pockets would be different. The design and location of the seams would be different. She had to make decisions about how the garment was edged, how the zippers were finished, and how much room to leave around the waist for beer bellies. All those decisions would define that particular garment and determine its comfort and usefulness. You want to keep going? Or?
Yeah, a little bit on the next page.
Okay.
It's probably.
When she determined the garment's construction and size and shape of the cut pieces, she'd make a prototype. The model would tell her more than whether the garment met the manufacturer's stylistic requirements. It also told her how difficult the thing was to actually sew together. To test her patterns, she works with an 81-year-old Belgian woman who sews a sample of every design with actual fabric a manufacturer will use and gives her feedback, and then tweaks her patterns to ensure they're easy to make on a production scale, factoring in how the specific manufacturer likes to work. Some are very precise and cut her patterns carefully. These kinds of producers probably work with high-end, expensive fabrics, which they don't want to waste. For clients like these, Anne builds a 1/4-inch seam allowance, the space between the cut edge of fabric and the stitching, into her pattern. Other manufacturers cut sloppily, like chopping linguine, she said. So she gives them bigger seam tolerances. They'll have to buy more fabric than they need, but with more forgiving patterns, they can work faster.
Yeah, so think of different words that appear, like tweak, asking questions, trying to anticipate where the pressure on the final object is going to be. I mean, that's something that one doesn't get trained to do. That's something that comes, failure has led to a lot of those questions and concerns. And so there's this way of one building up that kind of tacit knowledge that I think is so important.
Absolutely. And that's what leads to innovation.
Yeah,
right? So
exactly.
she is developing an entirely new garment, but absolutely not from scratch. And the cool thing for me about these garments, I mean, whatever it is, like what I'm wearing, or the cotton knit hoodie, which is, in my estimation, one of the most fabulous pieces of clothing ever made. I'm not wearing one, but I should be for tonight. I mean, look, it comes with its own hat. You'll never lose it. And you can unzip it if you get too hot. It's such a brilliant piece of clothing. But what's amazing about this garment, the American Roots garment, for example, is that it was designed from the bottom up, right? For a particular need for a particular clientele. but everything that went into it is human knowledge, starting all the way back to when we first figured out how to cultivate cotton and spin it and all of that, right? So, and then what do you do with the yarn? Like the idea of knitting, who came up with that? How did you design knitting? Who came up with that? How did you design the needles? You know, how did you develop that craft? So the knit, and then the industrial knit, you know, on this scale, the very fine knit. But everything that we touch has, as far as I'm concerned, all of human history packed into it.
Actually, bird history too, because that's how people learned how to weave, was watching weaver birds.
But weaver birds weren't everywhere.
No, but then that sort of grows from there.
It's really fabulous to watch a weaver bird make a nest. I could do that all day long.
And then adobe nests. I mean, I had James Crosett come in and we talked in a vessel class about nests one time in terms of weaver birds and adobe birds and all sorts of things that the nests are incredible constructions.
They really are.
Well made.
We have learned a lot from birds, haven't we? And we just don't pay enough attention to them. Our birds are teachers.
The master craftsman.
So Ned, I wanted to ask you a question, if I may.
Yeah.
How are we doing on time?
We have time for a question, then we can
Good.
open up.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah. So Ned's incredible book, Global Objects, is just astounding. It's the only book of its kind. Now I'm sucking it up. What it does is it travels across time and space to illustrate. I hope I'm tell me if I get any of this wrong.
I'll grade you.
Okay. Okay, now I'm sweating.
No.
To illustrate how different cultures and have informed each other in terms of arts and crafts and you know, material culture basically, but also how cultures have actually mimicked things that they've seen. So for example, lacquer was originated in China,
East Asia,
okay.
Japan and China.
And then these lacquered goods were brought back to, for example, New England and other places, and they wanted to kind of mimic what they saw. They loved this idea of lacquer, but they had to invent a new way to do it based on the resources that we had here at the time. So
Because the lacquer basically polymerized. You couldn't ship it as a raw material because it would stiffen up and harden.
wow.
So
Okay.
therefore,
They
you
needed
had to figure out.
plastics.
It is considered a natural plastic.
Mhm. Okay. So Ned, so you're always looking at like the specificity of place and then how one informs another place halfway across the world. You have craftspeople talking to craftspeople across time and space through objects, and cultures talking to each other through time and space through objects. So what I wanted to ask you was, even in the modern industrial era, now we're all wearing things that were mostly produced in an industrial setting, right? And actually, a lot of us wear a lot of petroleum products, plastic. So maybe not even
Engineered products, right?
engineered products, right? Not even from a sheep or a plant. Can we find value in the mass-produced object?
I think the way to think about finding value from a consumer point of view, I assume is what you're asking. Or maybe
You're
even
open
from the
to
producer side, we
interpretation.
could do both. I oftentimes draw a distinction between mass production and batch production. And this is something that economic historians sort of talk about, that, and I see a lot of students these days just automatically assume it's either one-off or it's mass produced. And I think that does a disservice to the landscape, which is so varied. And the fact that most artisans are not sort of coming up with one and reinventing the wheel every single time they sit down to make something, but actually are relying on what you might consider workmanship of habit, and how one develops habit. It's not simply Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hours or something like that, but oftentimes it's this way in which you have a over your years of training and making that you've got a repertoire from which you work, that you don't have to waste all that time, and then use the time, the attentive time, to concentrate on something very specific. And this, I'm just talking about even a small shop, and the fact that you oftentimes are doing, you're not making one piece from start to finish, but oftentimes if you're set up for spinning, you're going to do a lot of spinning at one time. If you're set up for preparing wood stock for furniture or something, you're going to get all your boards set up in pieces, and then you might just sort of draw on those parts to assemble at different points. So time is not, time is sporadic. Artisanal time, any making time is sporadic, and it's situational. And as a result, you oftentimes have that ability to draw on parts and reassemble things, or you can do something which is I call batch production, which could be anywhere from, a set of 5 chairs or something to say maybe 100 pots or something like that, because of rhythm. And you do the preparatory stuff all at one time, but then the actual making, there's so much about rhythm in terms of Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi, who's a sociologist at Chicago, talks about flow and the importance of flow. And I think that that's something that it becomes so much easier to make. And I think that you can then scale that up in terms of, that's a small shop in which you oftentimes maybe have different people doing different parts and collaborating together. It's what apprenticeship was based on, was building common skill levels up together to make a shop effective.
So you can hit flow.
Yeah, so you can hit flow, and you can ensure a consistent kind of production. But then if you think about scaling up, what happens when you do a batch of 100, but there's still that kind of collaborative work. You're still relying on people, and how different it becomes once you get apprenticeship taken away due to scientific management in the early 20th century. Frederick Winslow Taylor writing this book in 1911, in which it's time motion studies and saying there's a best way to do shovel coal into a furnace. There's a best way to do this, to do that. And the managers become the arbiters of flow. And because for a variety of different reasons. One is efficiency. And so profit becomes really key. And whose profit? Because now you're more highly capitalized. And then I think that also what it does is it's also anti-union, because they don't trust workers' control. And so there's this whole development that starts right in the early 20th century that really speaks to kind of a decoupling of making and cooperative work, which you actually hit at. You hit on this several points in the course of your book.
Yeah, I do. But wait, could you tell the student story? Because I just found that so interesting, especially since we're looking now at what's happening with Boeing.
Yeah. So I was telling Rachel, Stend Glass, which I think most people have a sense of, colorless glass. I refer to as sort of dust catching tchotchkes sometimes.
No offense to that.
But the history of Stend is fascinating, because originally in the late 19th century up in Corning, they had an English trained glass craftsman named Frederick Carter, who they basically had a research and development arm of Stend. And so he'd be in there experimenting, with layering glass, doing something called intarsia, which is sort of dripping darker colored glass and then encasing it in clear glass. Trying to recreate Roman glass using modern techniques. Just wild stuff. And oftentimes not necessarily functional, but oftentimes, collectible types of things to put on your etagere or something like that. But then the owner, a younger member of the Houghton family, took over ownership of it in 1932 and thought, this is wasteful. We're paying this guy to do all this stuff, he doesn't, he's just testing out the market with all these different kinds of glassware. And he said, we need to be game players in terms of New York. New York is the art capital now in 1932. How can we rebrand Stend Glass? So remember, they're doing colored stuff, they're doing Millefiori. I mean, it's just, there's no coherent sense to it, but it's about other than glassness at that point. And so what Houghton does is sort of, okay, we're going to put Carter out to pasture. And we're going to bring in, sort of school-trained sculptors like Sidney Law and others. They're going to do the design work in New York. They're going to send drawings up to Corning. We're going to go colorless, and we're going to go with a modern aesthetic. And then bring it back down to New York, and we're going to sell it in an exclusive selling. So the whole system changes in what he's doing. And the people in the glass factory are considered, also trying to do is, produce what Sidney Law is drawing. And,
Right.
As you well know from the difference between drawing something and then thinking three-dimensionally is totally different.
That reminds me, so my grandfather had a factory. He made clothing in Philadelphia. I never met him. He died in 1962 before I was born. And then after he died, the factory very quickly shut down. But in those days, I don't know if you remember, if anybody remembers, but the labels on the clothing didn't have a designer's name. It had the factory's name. So factories would have designers in-house. And those people, read all the magazines and anticipated what was coming. And then my grandfather was the one who then took the samples to, all the fancy department stores in New York and Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, and got orders.
The in-house designers oftentimes rose within the system itself. And oftentimes what you'll find is the in-house designers often came, for clothing, they'd be tailors. For furniture makers, they'd be carvers. For silversmiths and manufacturing, they were the rapier chasers. I mean, it's always the people doing the most skilled work, but they sort of know the whole system of how to do it. They're the ones who are the in-house designers.
Right, so they're completely tied to the making.
Yeah.
And now, of course, we buy the designer's label, and this thing could be made by anybody, anywhere in the world, and we don't know what we're purchasing anymore, as far as I'm concerned. Again, it's part of that decoupling that we've been talking about of, the fabrication of this thing, the value of that it was made by somebody who was informed by the materials that they were actually going to use, knew their craftspeople, just like Anne did. Like, what tolerances do you need to be able to work in this particular factory? So, just a whole set of instructions that now has been so divorced from the object itself. I see it as somewhat of a tragedy. It makes me sad because I do pull some of these items out of my closet from my grandmother, things from the 50s, and quite honestly, it looks like it was made yesterday. It still looks brand new. So there's just, and the way they hang, there's so much care and craft because stuff was expensive. Things had value.
So I think we've gone on for a bit. So we'll open it up for questions, comments, people want to add something?
Yes. I think the problem arises, I think a lot of people would like to buy a small batch and like to buy Made in America, and then they look at the price. And when they can go to H&M and buy a t-shirt for the cost of a cup of coffee.
Right.
How do?
So let's talk about that. That's a great. So let's talk about that. Let me reverse engineer that question a little bit. Why is that thing so cheap? Why is the thing from H&M, from Shein, from Temu, from Nike, whatever it is?
Because it's volume. And they can use those materials and pay workers very, very low prices.
Right, so there is a huge complicated political answer for that, right? Which is part of what I discuss at length in the book. In order to get a 10 a $5 t-shirt, a $10 t-shirt, a $30 hoodie. Okay, in order to do that, you have to exploit so many people, so many resources, and so many currencies. So there's an incredible cost to those objects that we are pushing off to the future. But it's coming back to us. And it's coming back to us actually right now. So Elon Musk is discovering this, but a lot of people are too. So the younger generation, not me, people a little bit younger, are very driven by this cost, right? The bargain hunting. And so at this point, they don't care what the brand is anymore. So it used to be that you didn't care who the manufacturer, it used to be, okay, we don't care about the manufacturer, we care about the design. That became the brand. And now at this point, people are hunting for bargains, eager so much that they're buying what are called dupes, right? So now not even the brand matters, which opens up a door for companies abroad to take all of this knowledge that the American market has generated as to what we love, what works for us, and then produce it in the cheapest possible ways, sometimes using enslaved labor, certainly completely polluting. I mean, there are, I think, something like 3 rivers now in Bangladesh that are considered utterly dead, right? We have regulations here, that's expensive. Regulation is treating workers is expensive, right? Taking care of people is expensive. That's what's in the cost of the goods made in America. So now what's happening is those the off brands are sending millions of packages into America a day, direct from questionable sources. We have no way to trace anything about how that thing, and they are destroying everything. I mean, this is a cataclysm.
They were just saying, I just heard something on NPR about Temu being under investigation right now because of individual packages aren't being searched in the same way that even a container ship. It's much more effective to look at a container to see what's in there.
Right, so they're sending fentanyl too, but that's another story. Yeah, so it just spins out, like this is a very, very big issue, and I'm hoping to be able to write an op-ed piece about this very shortly. But so what's happening is that we thought we could offshore, we offshored. Incredible profit in that for about 20 years, right? And these brands just made incredible amounts of money, while destroying other countries and environments in the process. And now those countries don't need the American brands anymore because they can ship directly to the American market, not tariffed. By the way, this is all, it was all flying under there's a loophole. So it's all coming in straight to us. And that's how you get these cheap things. And so then I ask you, not why is this American good, say $40 instead of $20? But I think we need to really interrogate, why is this thing $20? What is the actual cost of that thing? So,
But people are buying it. I mean, that's the
It's
other
true.
thing, you know,
Yeah.
that there's the other side of that. The other part of that question is that I think that small batch people that I know doing that have a hard time finding workers or
Yes.
that have that. I have a friend who was knocking on doors at bakeries asking if their grandmothers could teach some people to sew. And I think that's another big obstacle, don't you think, to bring it back beyond even just the infrastructure of finding factory
Absolutely.
parts and things like that.
yeah, so actually there's a large discussion in here about that, about the workforce and who would do this kind of work. And if we were to bring manufacturing back, and I'm not just talking about apparel now, I'm talking about all kinds of manufacturing, which is critical to our economy and to our society. Like, we can no longer be dependent on all the other countries to provide everything that we need. I think that's a dangerous situation to be in. That's what America was in 1760. And you know, we fought the American Revolution wearing British made clothes shipped by the Dutch, I believe. I might have that wrong. But the first thing that George Washington did when he became president was try to figure out how to get Americans manufacturing. Because the cheap imports from England were still coming in, and he had to stem the tide and get Americans working. So you're asking about the workforce. I think you know, there's a part of it is training, right? Like getting people interested, as you are at a very elite level, but just like discovering the joy of making. I think also just the knowledge economy in general has to relearn the fact that, again, you cannot innovate unless you and clothing is one of the most, apparel is one of the most polluting industries in the world. Not just because of the amount of extracting from earth that we need to produce everything, but also because, you know, there's a lot of petroleum now in our clothing. It's also the transportation involved in moving all this stuff around the world. It's very exploitative. And then on top of that, there's so much overproduction, right? I mean, I'm sure you've seen this, but clothes are buried and burned and it never worn because there's so much overproduction happening, especially at the fast fashion level. But anyway, we need to overcome a lot to return manufacturing to, I think, where it needs to be. But I feel like the first step is valuing making, just very simply, right? It was the same problem with food. I mean, if you remember in the 1960s, like everybody's making frozen corn and stuff out of cans, it was pretty bleak.
And Jell-O.
And then, you know, you have Julia Child starting to talk about cooking, and then I like to talk about the Whole Foods model before Jeff Bezos, but Whole Foods was really, really critical because suddenly it developed a whole economy around demand for organic products that didn't exist before, right? And so that would have been unfathomable. Like, imagine, go back to 1979. Oh, you know, we're going to have like 50% of food is going to be organic in 30 years. Nobody would believe that. That's a random number. I don't know if that's true or not. But I mean, you need the demand. And so I do wonder whether there won't be some kind of slow clothing movement emerging as people start to understand first the costs of that cheap good. And then, I know it's a lot of work, it's a lot of mental work, but yeah, people have to connect a lot of dots, and then to start to recognize the labor that goes into this, and then maybe want to be part of that, but then also as a manufacturer, but then also to purchase it as well.
But we were also saying, so like you had the Whole Foods and then the connection to farmers markets at the same time. So a lot of this stuff there could be something on a larger scale, but also regional perspective as well.
Well, I mean, I endorse all that. I just don't think we should romanticize it.
No.
It's
no.
really hard.
It's
like really hard.
Yeah.
Which part is hard?
I think to get a brand off the ground in the United States, fully sourced from US materials.
I wrote all about
I mean, how much volume are they? You know, I mean, it's hard. It's hard work to find the machineries. It's hard to find the infrastructure. It's hard to find the workers. It's hard to find a zipper, you know,
Yes,
made
that's
here. I know a bunch of people who had to go to Vietnam. They tried, they dreamed, and they spent a bunch of money. And
Well, I'll tell you, I'll give you some good news. Technology is changing so fast, obviously, and a lot of it now is starting to look at apparel, since we're talking about apparel manufacturing. And I've actually connected with a couple of companies that are offering people like a one-stop shop, designers. So you envision it, and it's what you see, what you get sort of thing, and you know, you just lay it out, and we'll take care of the rest. And it makes it much easier for designers, because you're right, like to get a small brand off the ground, you saw what they went through, like working with a pattern maker. You have fabric limits, right? Like the bottom minimums. You need to find the workers. The infrastructure is in place, and it could grow if we could if we could do more connecting, I think through technology, which is what's actually happening now. Because there's such a desire for this, like you're feeling,
Yeah.
and you're so connected also to the pain, which is what this book is very much about. All the pain points. I think technology will help to solve some of these issues.
But the clock is ticking. That's the one problem, because I'm thinking about your way of talking about Ned Cooke,
Oh, yeah.
and somebody who really knows his American fabric in New York, that his sorts of connections, and he's getting older, and sort of who's there, where's his knowledge going to go?
Yeah.
Who's going to pick it up?
Right. But, I mean, we have a young
We gotta
man
do it.
right in this room who's doing it, and, these folks are, 40 years old and they're doing it, and so it is not impossible. It certainly takes a village, and it's definitely about, rebuilding knowledge, and rebuilding interest. That's the first thing, right? Like, let's value this constant.
That will be our last question.
Oh, sorry.
I was just gonna say, it's mindset, right? Like, because it all has to come. So like, if we change our mindset even around consumerism, like, why are we so wanting to bargain hunt? Where does that come from? It's because we just want to consume. We want the latest trends. We want the fastest thing. And when we have to buy something all the time for whatever random motivation, we want it cheap because we're going to go buy the next thing. So we need that cheap too, instead of to what Matt and I are colleagues, what we've talked about ad nauseum is when you buy, or you mentioned your grandmother's apparel from the 50s, when you buy one thing that you've invested in, that cost value spreads over so long that your cost per wear is a cent a day when it lasts for years and years and years, as opposed to something so disposable.
I think the tide is really turning. Thank you for that. I mean, I think people are starting to really see the photos of the garbage that is. I'm sure you've seen just horrifying photos of overstock just being thrown into pits. I mean, at some point, I hope people make that connection. That is the price of cheap clothes. That's it's right there. And you can't ignore it. At some point, we won't be able to ignore it. But yeah, I mean, look, we're in a tough spot, right? We're dependent on plastics, single-use plastics drive you bananas, but I used one today. Like there's a lot of stuff you can't avoid. Yeah, I know. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's like how our society was designed, but it's not inevitable. It was never inevitable, right? And this is what I'm doing. I'm writing about it. Baby steps. I take this out to the world, please. This is what I can do. What can you do?
Great. I just want to say, I think Connecticut has heard you. They're changing their tagline. Connecticut, make it here.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming tonight.
Thank you.